Hello, welcome to Local Lives. Today I'm joined by the wonderful guest, Angela Grier. If you'd like to give us the pleasure of introducing yourself.
Okay, nistunitani ko Payok Sabansky, nitutua apot si Piikani ni Siksigate sa Tabi. My name is Angela Grier, and I'm from the Piikani Nation of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which Mohkinstsis, Calgary is located on, of our traditional territory. My role here at Brighter Psychology is I'm a registered provisional psychologist, and I also work with the Siksika First Nation, and I also do work with Braden, with the Arctic Rose Foundation, and work with the Canadian Counseling Psychotherapy Association based out of Ottawa. So that's a little bit about me.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, to speak into your role as a psychologist, would you mind talking a little bit about your journey to becoming one?
Sure. My journey started quite a long time ago. I really did not foresee myself being this far along in my education, especially as a high school student. I was actually kicked out of FP Walsh in Fort Macleod. Shout out FP Walsh in grade 12. And I had gone through quite a tumultuous adolescence and, the intergenerational traumas that we often experience as Indigenous folks, with my family being residential school survivors, my grandparents, my parents. So I did not see this path. My mother was a woman of service in our community. She was in social work, and she developed the first children's services office in our community and worked from a perspective of prevention and bringing kids back home, opposed to our children leaving our communities. So she was really ahead of her time. She worked with Dr. Cindy Blackstock. Some people might know her and her work she does today. So I was able to watch this woman of service, as well as her sharing the stories of our grandparents and our ancestors and kind of those obligations to help, to be helpers, which was our primary role as Nitsitabi, Blackfoot people, which is what we call ourselves, Nitsitabi. And I just grew up watching people take care of people. And so I originally wanted to study dinosaurs, and that was not going to happen. I became a young mother, and that was the point where things really changed for me. The responsibility, the want to do better, to pull me out of that difficult adolescence time I was coming out of into young adulthood. And it was the best thing that could have happened to me. And so I had this person I had to take care of, and my whole worldview just really shifted. And so moving through school, finding something I was interested in, going to the Lethbridge College for upgrading and then general studies. And then my friends, we all went over to the U of L, and I started a psychology degree. And I finished up, moved back to the community, was working in my community in suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention, which is taking care of people after a suicide happens, their families, their friends, things like that. And I noticed the responsibilities were just really being thrown at me. I was expected to do a lot more than what I was trained for. And because our people here, you have a psychology undergrad, we assume you're this therapist, and that's not the case. You need to go into graduate studies, get your master's, even your PhD, to do that work. So that's kind of what spurred me to go back to school to get my master's, and had a really great opportunity. I was also working with the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Lethbridge at the time. So I got to be in school and work at the school U of L alumni, and it was a great school. So I had a lot of being able to be in my home territory, an hour away from my home community. I was very privileged to do that. I know you're far from home yourself, so I know that that is a privilege, but it really was just about stepping up and taking more responsibility, being a part of the solution as best as I could is kind of what brought me back into school, and always being a person of service, always being in the helping field. I've worked in the justice industry, children's service, advocacy, children's human rights, post-secondary adult education. So I've always been in the kind of field of helping, and now it's just really specializing those skills and being a therapist.
So you really followed your mother's steps of being a woman of service.
I did. I always thought, geez, it would be nice to be a bean counter, an accountant or something, but that's just not in my nature. And I wouldn't want to be anything else. It took a long time to get here, but all of that, those blood, sweat, and tears, all the lessons were all of value, because now those teachings and things I went through in my life or experienced give me ability to relate to my clientele much better if I hadn't had some of those experiences. Yeah.
You've had quite the ride.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's been tough, but I'm also grateful because, like I said, in the darkness, in the struggle, the beauty is in the struggle. Beauty in the struggle.
It's wonderful you're able to find the light at the end of the tunnel. Now, I am curious, though, as to the role intergenerational trauma from residential school, colonialism, and the structures those have imposed, the role that had on your educational journey.
A lot. My mom was one of the first people to be educated in our community. And so I remember her going to U of C when I was like 4 or 5, and me running around in Crowchild area. So she always advocated for education. She knew that that was our new buffalo. That was our survival. So even though I didn't necessarily see myself being educated as a young person, she pushed for it, and it was more natural for it to happen because I grew up with somebody who went to university. And my brother is an accountant. He's got an accounting degree. So it was really important to us. Our kids are in school, not all of them, but they're all see the value of that being a part of their lives to move ahead, getting some form of education. But the colonialism, I've been studying colonialism for over 25 years. I stepped into that as soon as I started my undergrad, my post-secondary in the mid-90s. It's like, wow, I'm so old. But instantly it was a part of the healing to go through that education, because like many students who haven't heard this research or read the research or read the history, come in connection with that in through post-secondary, because it's not in the K through 12 system. It's not taught. It's hidden. It's a hidden history. So when we come into it in post-secondary, it can be really jarring, really stressful, really painful. A lot of vicarious trauma, a lot of anger you have by learning and doing these reports and research papers and so forth. So I did have my mom share a lot of stories about our history, the stories of residential school before, the whole thing kind of blew up. So I did have some of that awareness. And because she was in service, it was very closely tied to the political workings in our community and our nationhood. So I always had that kind of ear to the ground on those things. So having the inside world view and experiences as a First Nation on a First Nation is the reality I grew up with first, that experience. And then when I had gone to school, everything was just kind of matching, articulating some of the things I went through. So it gave me a language, it gave me the research skills. Um, School is really important, but one of the things that stood out for me was the Indigenous faculty in the schools at the time. And shout out to Dr. Leroy Little Bear and Amethyst First Rider, Lois Frank, some of my Indigenous professors back in the day who would literally take us into their homes, show us their lives, show us these successful role models, do over and above for these Indigenous students who showed up and showed interest. And to me, that's why we always have to give back in the same way, because somebody did that for us back in the day. And if it wasn't for those people giving us reference points in those institutions, we could have fallen into different, places that might not have been so good, but they kind of were the anchor through that journey that, helped move us through. When I'm studying American Indian law, legal systems, or Indigenous philosophy, or Native American studies, all of these things that, we all took. I didn't major in Native American studies, but I took as many courses as I could get my hands on, as well as my psychology requirements, because I was just enthralled with what it was doing for me. It was very healing. It was, like I said, giving me a language, giving me tools, giving me facts about, what was going on back home, tying these things together, understanding why there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prisons, was a big part of my study back then, so things like that. And eventually led me down into a path of, okay, so now what? I learned about this colonization of our people. So now how do we decolonize? That was, kind of the next journey of that, hence my psychology degree, okay, I want, colonization in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that psychologists use to diagnose disorders. I want racism as a delusionary disorder, because it is. I want these things in this institution of psychology that is decolonizing psychology, calling it, letting us have the pen to the paper in this discipline to do our assessment, of what we see. So that was driving me. I was around a lot of change makers, a lot of really amazing minds. I was really grateful to be exposed to Indigenous scholars throughout my career. So I was really blessed that way. That really helped guide me.
Well, it sounds like you've been carrying quite the burden as well through, your studies and journey of advocacy. But now you've really opened up my curiosity, and I have a few questions from what you've just shared, if that's okay. You mentioned that education is the new buffalo. For those who may not know, what was the old buffalo? What was its significance?
The old buffalo was the buffalo for us as Blackfoot Plains people, Plains Indian people. The buffalo was the animal, as we call ini in Blackfoot, was our food, clothing, and shelter. So it was everything. We've had a high reverence for that animal, And we had a relationship with that animal. It took care of us. And I'm glad you brought that up because right now I want to bring some attention to the Indian Initiative, which is a bison restoration project that is going on under the Buffalo Treaty, called the Buffalo Treaty. And that has been really facilitated by Dr. Leroy Little Bear, who's a Kainai Blackfoot scholar and Aboriginal legal expert lawyer. And he was the first Indigenous person to be cited in the Supreme Court. So he really helped facilitate Aboriginal title, change the Canadian Constitution to include Section 35. He's kind of one of the legal grandfathers. Him and his brothers, his legal Indigenous brothers, of course it takes a team to do that, alongside, the treaty advocates and Indian Brotherhood back in the day, which now is AFN, but it was a grassroots. So anyway, he's done significant work in changing the legal jurisdictional conversations in Canada for First Nations and globally. And now his work and his passion is on buffalo revitalization. And so bringing our buffaloes back to our territory because they went nearly extinct. And so as they took care of us back in the day, it's our turn to take care of them. And so education as the new buffalo is, education is going to give us our livelihood, our food, shelter, and clothing.
That's beautiful. Holy smokes. This full circle.
Yeah.
Now, I am curious about, you touched briefly on it, about how important was community for you as you pursued your studies?
Well, it was everything, right? Growing up in my community, very, very fortunate to have had that. And at a time when there wasn't internet, cell phones, this kind of disconnection from human engagement. Even though we are more connected globally now with these things, back then we were physically more connected. So in space, with each other in spaces. I was fortunate to have that, a child of the 80s, those were good times, good music too. But community was everything because I got to grow up seeing my community in its beauty, in its glory, growing up camping out in our timber limits on the land, being a part of a large extended family in our clans, just having that real sense of community. I'm grateful for that. And so everything about me today is because of Piikani, because of being a Piikani woman, a Piikanaki, a Blackfoot woman. So community really was my motivation because growing up there, you're invested in that place and they shape you and they teach you and groom you and teach you things that are important. So I was mentioning earlier the story of Scabby Rope with our nation in Piikani that, one of our personality traits as Piikani people is to be humble. And, it's a challenge in this world nowadays because we kind of have to market ourselves, right? But the humility comes in never being too busy for people who need our help, people who reach out for something. When we're asked to do something, we have to respond. And so, when my nation has asked me to go back and help and participate, I have been able to respond to those calls to act. When they wanted me to come back and to do work as a therapist with the kids in care, in 2016, I went back and I did that. When I was moved home after my mom passed away, I was asked to join council, even though I did not want to run for council. as an elected leader, but because I was asked by different people, I took that responsibility on and was able to fulfill that term for 4 years and stick with it, even though it was hard. So when we're asked to do something, we try to be that their first and foremost priority. I may not work directly there, but I still have my ties there. I still have a home there. I get to work with the Blackfoot community, the Confederacy still in a way with Siksika. So community is very important to me. It is. I wouldn't be who I am without it. It teaches us our virtues, our values, and it's grounding. I'm very, very fortunate to have that. Being in the city of Calgary, seeing a lot of Indigenous people from all over the world. Some of them have never had a sense of community. Some of them have never even known their own family members, like the kids in care. And to me, that's why I know it's a very special thing to have those connections. And that drives me to help people make those connections, whether it's interpersonally or within their own territories. So it definitely shapes a big part of my life and work.
Now, what would the younger version of you who is just getting started in her studies, what do you think she would think of where you are now, having given so much back to the community as a whole?
That younger version, she was really rotten. She was, didn't take too much seriously, a little spoiled at times. What we jokingly say rotten, but loved dearly. And even at a young age, I knew that even if we had a little bit of something, I was grateful for those things. And it was, always knowing if I had something, we needed to share that. We needed to think about people who didn't have a little something. So it was kind of brewing already, but I just at that time, being a younger kid in, being a bit lost, having some trauma, a good bout of trauma, have gone through stuff, grew up too fast. I don't think that kid could have seen this person, this woman today. It just is not fathomable. Like I said, having my son, Alex, Mokoistamik, he changed my life and gave me direction and purpose. And then it grew from there. So it's always, I always kind of pinch myself like, I don't know how this all happened. It just was keep going, keep trying. We have a saying in Blackfoot, ikakimat, never give up, keep trying, try hard. It's kind of what it means. And so we were raised with that. Just keep trying. Don't give up. Like, there's no option. You don't have another option. You have people who love you, who are relying on you. Even those who aren't born yet are relying on you, right? My grandparents, survivors of, genocide and residential school, and my ancestors fought so hard to keep us alive as a species, as a race, as a human race of people. Who am I to give up against those odds, right? I always thought about that, is I'm grateful to be here because I know what we came from, right? So it's what kept me going.
A manifestation of that strength.
Yes, yes.
Now, you also spoke about how important it was having, those reference points, that representation in, the education system while you were going through it. How does it feel now to be that reference point or that representation itself?
It's pretty surreal, When I went through my graduate studies, It wasn't easy. I was the only person of color in my cohort in my master's of counseling psychology, and it was tough. There was a lot of unconscious bias. There was a lot of institutional racism. There was no TRC. There was no, kind of those buffers that we have today, thank goodness, um, that help our kids be successful. I was fortunate to have a good, solid circle in my personal life that helped me get through those difficult parts of school. But it also, I never knew I was almost on the honors for my graduate. And so from coming from a kid kicked out in grade 12 and being kind of told, you're not smart, you don't got, you're not of worth of investing in, you're not, we're even going to kick you out. To go from that to being in my master's with, over like a 3.7 GPA, 3.8 at times. I would have never, ever thought, I don't even know how I did that. And I had children going through school. I was holding a full-time job. I had relationship challenges, went through a divorce, had a baby, during my master's, my youngest. So there was a lot of things that I had to get through, a crazy schedule, but I just knew I couldn't turn back, that every opportunity that came in front of me was meant to be. I knew it was meant for me. And when you come from a place where you don't have a lot of opportunities, you don't take those things for granted. You take every opportunity. And especially, I was very fortunate to have my mom as my biggest cheerleader, who said, yes, you can do it, go to school, finish your schooling, and, and good people around me too, like my adopted parents, Leroy and Amethyst. And, I was very privileged to have that and have people believe in me and want to see me succeed, so, yeah.
You might say your life in a whole with all your accomplishments is the ultimate resistance or resilience.
We call it a coup. I counted coup on those principals who kicked me out. And I counted coup on the institutions who wanted to marginalize my voice and, challenged my worldview. And, but I don't want to be, kind of naughty about that or arrogant. I'm proud because the journey's not over, there's still a long uphill to go. But if this is where it stopped, I'm very proud. I can say it took me a long time to be okay with being proud of myself. It wasn't always a thing I could say, because we also grow up with a lot of lateral violence in our communities of, our people internalizing the colonizer, internalizing the oppression, internalized racism, where we turn on ourselves, we turn on each other, and we pull each other down. Growing up with that my whole life, that was a real challenge, right? Let alone the racism we were battling in our schools, high schools, universities, even in our community because of that illness of colonization that came into us. So it wasn't easy. It was against a lot of odds, and I really don't know how I did it. I just say my kids made me fight hard to give them a good life. I loved them more than I loved me, and many, many times probably still do, because they're the reasons I work so hard so I could create that generational wealth, whatever that means. But generational health, right? That's more about what I'm about. Is I want them to have like safety and stability and a safe home, to me, that I want them to have love and know that they're loved, and just for them to be happy, do what they want to do to be happy. And that's my biggest success. It truly is. Yeah.
One of those generational wounds.
Yes. Yes. Breaking those cycles. That's what it's all about. Bringing ourselves back home, back to the center of our spirit. We're not meant to suffer. We're not put on this earth to suffer. We're put on to be the brightest light, to tap into our most optimal self. And I want all of humanity to have that, to be happy and healthy. We wouldn't have this nonsense that we have now out there going on, right? So we all need that.
We spoke about the struggles of lateral violence on one side and the racism on the other. What was your medicine for that?
I think it was, my mom would always talk about how her mom, as hard as my grandma worked and my grandparents worked and showed their love through that way, because of the residential school impacts, sometimes they couldn't even show affection to their kids, to say, I love you, to hug them, to give them affection, goodnight kiss. My mom switched that. She would always tell us, I never got this, so get over here and give me a kiss goodnight. She was very affectionate, very loving. My brother and I are like that with our kids, and I think it was that love that she showed us. That was the ingredients. That was the essence of our spirit. That alongside our spirituality and our culture, because in our culture, we develop these kinship circles, these circles where we get adopted in, right? You don't have to be blood related. You just kind of get adopted. We call it custom adoption. And those communities that I came into my life, and they know who they are, they gave me so much more than they'll ever know. And the basis of our spirituality is love. So we do everything in what we say, kimapipitsini, compassion and kindness. We do everything with that in mind, how we try to walk in the world, how we try to work with each other, try to understand that somebody could be going through something. How would you feel if you were in their shoes? Really try to be mindful. And I think that's a big part of what helps me as a psychologist is I have that basis of being a nurturer. And I grew up watching people take care of each other, right? The aunties, the OG, my aunties. I watched my mom and her sisters literally take care of people in their hardest hours, whether it's people on their deathbed or people through a funeral. Many funerals they did, raising funds, responding to accidents, helping people when they're in crisis. I grew up watching those natural helpers. And so what always stood out for me when I was in school in my graduate studies is how I had no problem in the counseling skills, building rapport with my client, whereas some of my other colleagues, they really were clinical and they were really had a hard time making those connections. And I realized, it's because I grew up watching people help each other. I grew up in a collective culture, a collective setting. I didn't grow up in an individualistic society. I grew up in a collective society where you helped each other. You were, you were in things together. And sometimes it was, there's a fine line of where it's healthy and not. But I realized that's where things came in. That's where there was this little extra edge I had because we grow up with kimapipitsini, with that compassion, that love for each other, which I'm so grateful to be Blackfoot, so grateful to be First Nation, because I know a lot of people who weren't, and even some of my fellow students who would always come to me and say, oh, I wish I had your culture. I wish I had families like you. I wish I had a community like you. They felt very alone. And I heard that, and I still hear that from a lot of people, non-Indigenous folks. And so I know that we're very blessed. We have something special, and I try to just take the positive from what I can and leave the rest, right?
The community aspect is
Yeah,
so beautiful.
it
The
is.
collective, the interdependence.
Yeah.
So now I want to jump back a little bit to, you spoke briefly about decolonizing. I know there's probably quite a few who are watching who don't know what that means. Would you mind maybe breaking that down?
Well, I guess to understand decolonization, we have to understand colonization. Um, Colonization for us is kind of the um, imposition of Euro, values that or ways of doing that were imposed upon us, such as economy, slaughtering our entire buffalo species, wiping out our economy at first at contact, taking us off of our traditional territory, and we were going to talk about the land-based Blackfoot territory. So taking us from our beautiful Blackfoot territory, which encompasses the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains to the South Saskatchewan River in Edmonton, to the Cypress Hills in the east, and to the Yellowstone National Park in the States. That's traditional Blackfoot territory. We protected and lived here since time immemorial, much older than Christianity, eons before Christianity. Our artifacts that are getting unearthed now are going back to 100,000 years old. So we know we were ancient people, and when settlers came, removing all of that way of life, and forcing us into what we now call reserves, what we call postage-sized stamps of land compared to the mass Blackfoot territory. That's colonization. So the imposition of European values and ways of doing, and in this case, English, Britain, the values that were there, their version of colonization, felt it was beneficial to benefit them and them alone. And so for us, every dignity and humanity and integrity we held as a people was completely pushed aside for the benefit and theft of our territories, resources, livelihood, medicines, etc. Even now, the appropriation of culture, it continues this theft in many ways. That's colonization, right? The disconnecting us as First Nation people from our traditional languages, our spirituality. We went through a time in history where the Canadian government prohibited us from having our ceremonies. And when we had COVID, there was another time where it prohibited us from gathering, which flared up those intergenerational traumas. That's colonization. Taking the heart of our community, our children and our family structures, and destroying them through residential schools, 60s scoop, and modern day child welfare policies. That's colonization. People saying that, institutions, university institutions saying that they have the ultimate say of knowledge and education. We call that cognitive imperialism, meaning that one single linear small view of the world is the most important view, and their assessment, like an IQ test, is the assessment to how we study and rate our intelligence. That's colonization. So an example I heard through COVID, I remember listening on the radio and hearing the update from Dr. Henshaw every Friday afternoon at 3:30. And I remember after she spoke, the previous premier said, well, we've tried everything. We've done everything we can. And I was like, they never asked us. They never asked for our medicines. They never asked us, what do you think we could do? Is there a route? Is there some medicines? Because we were managing our COVID, our sicknesses. We did have teas. We did have medicines that we were using to take care of our people. So colonization is about power and control, and it's about disconnecting Indigenous people from their lands and their spirit. So decolonization is putting that all back together, right? And making things just, making things equitable, reconnection. So if colonization is about disconnection, decolonization is about reconnection. So reconnecting ourselves as Indigenous people in our territories with our spirituality, our original spiritualities, our original languages, our original medicines, our original foods. That's why the Buffalo Restoration Project is so important, because we are what we eat. And we're eating colonized foods now, and it's making us sick and it's killing us. You look at the health of Indigenous people in what's called North America today, the health pre-contact, when settlers came over and explorers came, they called us the people of God because we were so healthy and beautiful and almost what they called perfect beings. We didn't drink dairy, but our teeth and our bones were so strong because we ate bones. We had bone soup. We ate marrow. We had our own ways of doing this. I joke about that dairy because we're the only species on Earth who drink milk after infancy, right? And for us natives, we are lactose intolerant and we don't do well with it. So, those are colonizing our diet and our ways of thinking. So another agenda can flourish. So capitalism and resource extraction and, a crippling environment for for some billionaires to reside in this planet. That's colonization. So decolonizing is really reconnecting to our original way of life and health. And for us as Nitsitabi Blackfoot, that was only a couple hundred years ago. That was less than 200 years ago, right? For us, before we may have seen the Europeans a little bit before that, but we were still in what they call the dog days before the horse and the buffalo days. So we have elders that still can recall days of chasing the buffalo. So we weren't far from that. Your people weren't far from that. They're still living off the land. They're still being very much, that's what I love visiting the North, the Arctic people, because it's just a real reminder of those core values and ways of life, right? That's decolonization, is putting ourselves back together. And from an institutional perspective, decolonization is making space for everybody else. Canadians, non-Indigenous, non-BIPOC people are a global minority, right? BIPOC people are global majorities. So we're in kind of this weird identity crisis in North America where it acts like it's not the case, when BIPOC communities across the world are the majority communities. They're these Indigenous communities that, have the most population. But here in these colonized lands, because we're one of the most recent colonized spaces, it's just this very strange dynamic that ignores all of that history and all of those facts. So decolonization is really truth and reconciliation. It's really bringing the truth forward, honoring the truth, giving space and time like this to share perspectives and work through it, reconcile through it.
You're so well spoken and articulate. I could literally sit here all night and listen.
Thanks.
I do want to build off on one of your latest points there on the importance of holding space, and how important is it here, especially in Alberta, and on Treaty 7, to that non-Indigenous hold space within the community for Indigenous voices and storytellers and advocates and knowledge keepers.
Well, we have a saying in Indian country, not about us without us, right? So holding space from a non-Indigenous perspective doesn't mean to speak on our behalf. It means to create space, create opportunities for Indigenous voices to come to the table. Having Indigenous people in leadership, in board of directors, in board of governors of institutions, post-secondary institutions, Indigenous people in legislature, in the parliament, creating space for us to speak for our own self. Because as Susan Aglu-Clark, our good friend and mentor, always talks about this cultural cognizance, right? That nobody can tell our story the way we can, because we're the ones who experience it. I'm the one who has this color that gets profiled racial. So, nobody's going to know that feeling, that instant trigger of trauma, distrust, indignity at that very basic human level, just for being this color, right? Nobody's going to know that unless they've come from this experience. Nobody's going to know what it's like to live on the res or live in our communities and not have clean drinking water, or have, no power, or, we grew up with an outhouse, right? When I was really small, my mom would have to haul water. Even when I lived out on the res, when I was on council, our housing situations weren't the greatest. Sometimes I didn't have hot water. We'd boil and have bird baths, and go to town and shower at the pool. Those things you can't describe from a removed perspective. We have to be in those spaces to tell our story. We don't need somebody who hasn't been through those experiences through their lens, which will be limited because they didn't have those experiences, to try to, in their best intentions, we know about best intentions, but try to tell our story, because they have not lived this life. They have not lived with parents and grandparents who were intergenerational survivors of the residential school, or my mother, who was that and a 60s scoop survivor. Then they're not going to have that understanding. They're not going to grow up with being abused and terrorized in small town Alberta high schools or schools. Like my daughter going to school being told she's going to be a murdered and missing Indigenous woman by her white classmates, right? So, or students that I worked with at SAIT who said that they were going to get scalped by their, fellow peers in the program because they had a long braid. So, yeah, they're not going to know those experiences, or be hunted down and killed like the young man who was killed in Siksika by two neighboring farm boys, and who got off and never had charges. So people aren't going to know those types of things, or have watched people overdose in front of them in the community because of the opioid pandemic, which wasn't started by our people, right? So you have to be living these experiences to speak from them. So when we talk about our allies, it's not about them speaking on behalf of us. Create those spaces, create those opportunities and openings for our people to speak their truth.
So quite literally holding that space for Indigenous voices to come in,
Absolutely.
lived experiences you've just mentioned and all the hardships, how have those impacted your role within the community as an advocate, as a psychologist, as a mother,
Hmm.
grandmother?
Mm-hmm. Yes, my beautiful granddaughter Meadow. Thank you for bringing her up. It's made me very protective. I've been my kids just hate it. I'm the kind that if you don't answer your phone, I'm calling 14 times. I'm that mom. It's a trauma response because of all of the things we've grown up with, the tragedies, the loss, you know, in our lives, losing people so much around us since I was a kid to now can't even keep up with how many people in my community have passed. I hear about it and I'm just devastated in that moment. So I can't even keep up with it. And as a member of the Blackfoot community, we have 40,000 strong. And I know people on every one of those reserves in those communities. So we lose a lot of people. Our loss of life rate is very high, which is a systemic outcome of colonization. It's a direct link to we didn't die at these rates. We lived to be at least 100 years old before contact. This was not our way of life. This was not our state of health. So we know our health outcomes today are a direct reflection of contact and imposition of colonization. So when I remember hearing a saying long time ago, an educated Indian is a dangerous Indian. But it's because we're disruptors and we're not going to sit there quiet. We don't have that privilege. I always think about that in the spaces I'm at, I have a voice for people who don't. I have a voice for those friends and relatives that I lost who were way too young before their time. And if they had grown and had some support and didn't live in certain conditions because of the reserve system imposed on us, they would be out here speaking and they're not. And some of them have been stolen and lost and missing, right? Like our MMIW movement. So we don't have a privilege because many of our people are so broken and hurt by what we're surviving still, that, one of my colleagues, he called me a unicorn yesterday and I'm like, but it's like, okay, I get what you're saying because the world isn't used to seeing, a Blackfoot woman out there doing her thing and speaking her mind, right? And I get that. So it's a privilege. It's an honor. I've been blessed. I have to use that privilege in a good way. So it's definitely always been a part of my mindset to use my voice for those who don't have one. And when I was in council as an elected leader, it was very therapeutic to duke it out with the feds and the province, and therapeutic because it was also I got to see what those systems were about, and understand more about how to be a change maker. So not only do I have these privileges, but I have these experiences that continue to inform me as an advocate, continue to give me skills, knowledge, information, education to do this better. And so make changes. And you can't just fight, right? You can't just fight all the time. We have to show what diplomacy and democracy really is. We have to show what fiscal responsibility looks like. We can't be frivolous in our decisions. We have to have informed decisions. So for us as Native people and those back home who work in our communities, they know those things. They have to work in some of the most strict, rigid guidelines of the Indian Act, of contribution agreements and audit systems that are more scrutinized than any municipality in this country. So our government systems back home on the res, who receive federal dollars, are the most scrutinized peoples. And so we know how to do this work. We know what we're doing. it's just we aren't invited into the spaces. So my whole hope is that through my advocacy work, I can just help create more of those space to bring community in.
Do you have any advice for any young Indigenous who want to find their voice?
Absolutely. It really starts with you. It really starts, right here with the healing. We can't change anything of what we've gone through. We can only change now and in our future, but we don't forget where we come from, right? I'm not saying about forgetting. We still got business of the day to get done, that needs to be dealt with. Hashtag land back. But we have, it starts with you as a vessel. And it took me a long time to go through my healing, my personal healing, before I wanted to step back in the therapy ring and felt confident. And that's an ethical thing we have to do as practitioners, is you have to be well to do this work, to work with other people, to handle people's lives. That's a huge responsibility. And I don't take that lightly at all. And so it starts with our own healing and finding out what it is that we need to do for that healing. Healing comes in many facets, ceremonial, spiritual healing, mental health, educational healing, physical healing. It comes in many facets. So we have to find out all of those parts of ourselves and work on that first and foremost, because the spirit of who we are as Nitsitapi, as Indigenous people, that work's done. It knows what it needs to do. We've always known what to do. We've always known to protect our lands, to be with the people, protect the people. That is inherent to us. It's the disruption. It's the interference of colonization that causes us to be not well, that interrupts that whole advocacy process. So I've seen people be so educated, be in great positions, but their self-awareness might not be there, so they can't fulfill their potential the way they could if they really do that work. And that's for anybody, right? So yeah, I really think it starts within.
So your role of advocacy has had a huge impact on your clinical practice.
Absolutely. Interestingly, I work with a lot of young people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And one of the things I'm seeing more is climate anxiety. And so a big part of the fear of young people is they're inheriting these really terrible environmental conditions, disruption and destruction to our lands in the last 100 years. We took care of our lands for thousands of years. None of this stuff was going on. As soon as colonization came, we just saw a whole downward slide, extinction of species, people, foods, medicines, increase of sicknesses, all that stuff. So sickness of the mind as well, mental health, not just physical. So we're the original caretakers. We understand traditional knowledge systems. We're just sitting there waiting in the wings, as Dr. Little Bear says. Native science is sitting there waiting in the wings, ready to be, used. And we put that invitation out. So I think as an Indigenous advocate and, person who's been through some things, I bring that to the table. I bring that realism to the table, that humility, being able to have appropriate self-disclosure with my clients to be like, yes, I've been there. Like I've been there too. And, things like climate anxiety, acknowledging that it's not something that's not real. It is real. These kids are scared. They're struggling. The fires trigger their anxiety and their depression, because anxiety and depression go hand in hand. So, acknowledging and validating them, I think, is a huge part of the rapport building with my clients. And I work with Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So I think that it brings a lot to the table. Absolutely.
You touched on a bunch of different aspects of land back and the importance of it. Would you mind maybe breaking that down a little more?
Absolutely. First of all, the land was stolen. We have right now, in the 1930s, the Natural Resource Transfer Act was established in Canada that gave provinces authority over natural resources. And so there was no consultation or consideration for First Nations. That's our land. And there was never any compensation, any kind of inclusion in that decision. And we see where that got us 100 years later almost. And all the destruction that's taken place, the exploitation and so forth, the mismanagement of those resources of land. If we were included and at the table, I guarantee you the state of environmental crisis would not be where it's at. We, again, like I said, our conservation efforts we're original stewards of this land, these lands, and we knew how to work with the environment, not against it. It was a reciprocal relationship of, give and take, and only taking what you need, and being very mindful. My son is a hunter. They have all sorts of rules to doing that from a Blackfoot perspective, as your people do too. You don't hunt certain animals certain times. You watch the indicators of when a species is going down. Like, we have all those natural conservation instincts and knowledge, traditional knowledge. So we rightfully need to take this land back to manage it for the continuation of a species as human beings, because right now, with the state of where it's going, I don't know what that's going to look like if it continues. So I think people are waking up to that understanding and, trying to right the wrong. And I know there's this 2050, timeline that the governments and the global communities have set up to kind of, get things into a good place. We need that now. Right? We need to make shifts now. I loved how during COVID, when everything shut down, we saw these animals coming into their natural territories again. And it was just amazing. That was very hopeful to me. So it was a small period of global shutdown, and we saw such a drastic recovery in the natural world and the natural system. So the data's there. That's a blessing out of COVID, is we got to see a lot of these things. So I hope that they're going to start studying that. But land back is really about sustainability as a human species, because as the original stewards of these lands, we know these lands very deeply and intimately for time immemorial, thousands and thousands of years, older than Christianity, and definitely older than settlers in Canada. It's a drop in the bucket compared to what our knowledge systems and our language and our songs and ceremonies have within knowledge they have in those structures. So because our cultures, our Indigenous cultures, are land-based, they're land-specific. So a Blackfoot is a Blackfoot because they're in Blackfoot territory, because of the animals that are our relatives. I'm not going to go and identify with the killer whale like the Salish or the people of the West Coast. That's not a part of my culture. The animals here and the land here are specific to our bloodline. So I think land back is about rightful putting things back in balance ecologically, but also the healing for Indigenous people to have access to their territories and their resources and economies, modern day economies as well, to be able to have equity, to have health equity, to have financial equity, to have, all of the equity that we rightfully should have in our own lands.
Now, you touched on the importance of recognizing, that you're Blackfoot. That's where you come from. This is your territory, your land, your people, your culture.
Yeah.
And, not Salish and how different, similar it is. And would you mind speaking on the importance of not just brushing all 600 nations here in Canada under the umbrella term Indigenous?
Yeah. Pan-indigeneity is something that it really makes my teeth grind. We're not a melting pot. For example, Treaty 7 is the traditional territory. In the Treaty 7 is a new concept. It was in 1877 it came to life. Blackfoots are much older than that. The history of Treaty 7, for example, is our Stoney Nakoda relatives and our Dene Tsuut'ina relatives were fleeing for their lives upon encroachment of colonization, and we adopted them and allowed them to come into our territory under our own treaties, our own relationships in Nestsi. And so that's the history there. So when we look at that history, we need to get specific because there's a lot of knowledge and information. When you do land claims, for example, in the federal system, they're not looking at pan-indigeneity. They're looking at specific oral culture, specific ceremonial content that validates those people to attain a land agreement, to win a case. So if it's recognized in the highest legal courts, why are we still being lumped in these social structures, social services, post-secondary education? We are 660 distinct peoples, nations across the country, learning about the Inuit communities, very distinct. You guys do not want to be lumped in. You're all distinct. I love it. I got a lot to learn on that. So when we look at those things, if we're getting specific about reconciliation is proximal. So it's in the space you're at. So in Blackfoot, like when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? When in Blackfoot territory, do as Blackfoots do. I'm not going to go into Cree territory and start telling them how to pray or, how to be. The protocol is when I cross, just like our trickster Napi, when he crosses that river, South Saskatchewan River, he turns into a Sakachuk, the Cree trickster, right? We have those ancient understandings and stories that show us our natural boundary system, and we respected each other. It wasn't until colonization came that started this divide and conquer mentality. We had basic respect. We had honor in war. We had honor of economies. We had honor in sharing and trading systems. It wasn't what we're seeing today. So there's not an Indigenous culture. When I hear that, I'm just like, what is that? There's Indigenous cultures, and I don't want our unique, beautiful identities to be stripped away and lumped into one pot, literal melting pot, and cooked up and served up into this whatever, people might be benefiting from doing that. We have a saying in Blackfoot country about, at least from my elders' teaching, is watch out for the, just add water medicine men, right? We don't need people to be exploiting our cultures and claiming to be doing all these sort of ceremonies and whatever. We know we have systems in our community of validation. We have empirical knowledge systems that we know who is an elder and who's not, who is recognized as a sanctioned transferred authority elder knowledge keeper and who isn't. So it's up to us to lead those conversations, because if people aren't from our communities, they're not going to know anything. You could be hiring some guy off the street who's claiming he's something, and we're looking at you like, like, what are you doing? So, that respect and homage to our distinct cultures, again, has to be Indigenous led, right? We're not doing our people a service by having this cultural confusion. especially when I think about the kids in care who want to learn their identity, who've been stolen and taken and robbed of that, when they start searching out and wanting to reconnect, or anyone who's been displaced, they deserve to have the truthful history of their people, not some mismashed, melting pot of a culture that doesn't exist, right? So that's a little bit on that pan-indigeneity.
And that too goes hand in hand with land back
Yeah.
as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's right. That's right.
Now I'm going to jump quickly to your thesis from your Master's of Education and how it was about using Blackfoot prayer as a means of healing. How has this influenced your current practice and working with Indigenous youth and adults within the Blackfoot community?
My thesis is called Estumat Dominiki, which means embodiment. And it was, we used that term, my elders and I, because just saying this is that is too definitive, and we're not definitive people. Healing and learning is lifelong. We don't ever get to a place where we're like, okay, got my PhD, I'm done, I'm good, I know everything, right? We don't operate that way. We have PhDs in our communities in terms of cultural PhDs, the highest forms of learning, right? People who have gone through Bomaksin, what we call the transfer of authority. They've gone through and graduated, come in, participate, graduate, become a parent, and then move into mentorship, and they become a grandparent role. So we have those structured knowledge systems, and I speak from a Blackfoot perspective, and I know other of my brothers and sisters throughout Indigenous communities have similar ways of validating their knowledge. So I knew that when I was studying, getting ready to do some research in my graduate work, I looked at all the schools of thought in psychology, and I could not really connect with any of them. We know that the grandfathers of psychology were white middle-class men, and that just wasn't going to work for me. That does not represent where I come from. When I thought about, okay, if I'm going to put my heart into a piece of work, a contribution to the academy, I need it to be real. I can't do some fluffy, whatever study. I need it to be something tangible that we can stand on, that is rooted in the truth of what I believe. And of course, it's our Blackfoot ways of doing. And our Blackfoot ways of doing are ultimately rooted in our spirituality. Our spirituality is connected to everything that we do as a Blackfoot person. Our value systems. One of my elders had said, our prayer, a Blackfoot prayer, is like our ingredients for life. It has a structure, right? And at the very beginning of the prayer, we're acknowledging all of the entities, the sky beings, the land beings, the water beings. And the sky beings are the birds, the moon, the stars, the universe, the air, everything, and so forth. Then we go into acknowledging our ancestors and so forth. And at the very end, we get to throw something in for ourselves, right? We're not the first. We're not the first. And that keeps us humble, right? Because again, the basis of our identity is to be helpers. That's who we are as Nitsitapi. We help each other. We're a collective culture. So at the end of that prayer, I'm going to throw a little bit of something in there for me. Give me a little bit of help in this specific area, right? So when we break those things down, I was so blessed to be around elders like Alan Pard, Narcissus Blood, Frank Weaselhead, Pete Standing Alone, and Andrew Blackwater, Andrew Delaney, so many of these elders who are gone now and passed on. I always knew we have to capture their voices because they're not going to be here forever. Those are some of the last really fluent and traditional knowledge holders that were just really connected to our old ways. And, we have to preserve our elders. We have to take care of them because they're like libraries. There are libraries. They're just full of information. And so I was really privileged to work with those elders and others, Carol and John Murray from Piikani Piikani, Stuart Breaker from Siksika, all of these elders from our communities, Jerry Potts, Jim Swag from Piikani, that were so generous with their teachings. They never, expected any money. They didn't expect, and that's what our kind of our flag is, our green flag is work with the elders who are generous. Again, gima bipitsini, they're ready, compassionate, they're helpful, they're kind. And so I was really grateful to work with them, and they shared information. They were the gatekeepers of public knowledge and sacred knowledge because they were in those societies. So they were the ones who could say, whatever I tell you is okay to be recorded. What I'm not going to tell you, you're not going to know, because you better get in those societies if you want to know that, right? So, shout out to my son, Alex, who has dedicated all his whole life since he was a tiny little guy to being in those societies right now. And he's moving, through them and becoming a true, Blackfoot knowledge holder. I'm so proud because that's a sacrifice to do, right? These elders are on call 24/7, 365. I'm only on call at these certain hours of a week, right? And then I shut down. You can't get a hold of me, right? I don't have to live in that world because it's such a commitment. And maybe someday when I'm old, I will, right? When I'm really, really old. Right now, maybe not. So I have a lot of reverence for those knowledge holders whose prayers that we kind of ride on their coattails. We know they're praying for us. We know that they're helping us. And so I have so much reverence for that way of life because it encompasses our whole worldview. If you want to know about Blackfoot people, come and learn about our spirituality. That's what you'll see. You'll learn who we are. It'll talk about the land. It'll talk about the politics. It'll talk about everything because it's who we are is all encapsulated in that. So my thesis was really a development. I wanted to create a framework, not kind of a curriculum or anything, but something for people to draw from who were going to read the thesis. And it was meant for therapists, really, but helpers. And many people have come to me now, especially from the Blackfoot community, and told me, hey, I've read your thesis. And I'm like, like it's such an honor when people acknowledge it, because I forever it was just sitting there and nobody ever talked about it. I was really proud of it. Proud of my being the conduit for these elders to translate, bring the old to the new. I'm just a conduit. That's not our knowledge. It's everybody's knowledge. So when it comes up, it's like, oh, it's like actually getting some traction now. Like, it always blows me away, right? So it seems to be something that it was meant to be. It was meant to be a contribution. It was meant to help, and it helps our people. It helps, non-Indigenous people to understand us a little bit. It's a framework for people to draw from. It's not to tell you exactly A, B, C, D, E, what to do. Like a good storyteller, our elders, we go to them and ask them for help. They'll give us a million stories and we got to figure out the answer from those, right? So it's kind of the same thing. I let these elders tell their story, and I tried to pull some things together and create some themes. So I'm really glad that you talked about that, and thank you for acknowledging that. And yeah, I hope that it's still giving. It's meant to be a living it's thing. It's rooted in our spirituality. And again, I had permission from our transferred authority elders. What's in there has been written about in some context before, or is considered public knowledge. So they were the gatekeepers.
It must be so special to have been that vessel, and then to now watch your son carry on that journey and
Oh, yeah.
knowledge holder.
Oh, he is so special. And he teaches me every time we're together. He grounds me, you know. I tell this story about him. It's cute because he was just, geez, a teenager when I was in council. And I wanted to quit. Every year I was in council for 4 years. It was so hard, right? I was a single mom. I was a woman. It was tough. And we're up against provincial, federal governments, and we're, you know, a poor little First Nation. We didn't have much money. We're the second lowest paid council in Canada, right? So we were like hard. We were working hard. We had a lot of stuff against us, but we worked hard, and I'm proud of the work we did. And so I was in there, and I remember the first year I wanted to quit, and I was complaining, and my son heard me. And he's like, but Mom, you made that commitment at the inauguration, right? I was like, oh my God, okay. You know, you teach your kids these things and then they come back and they put that mirror up in front of you. And it's like, yeah, these little guys are watching. I can't give up like that, right? And I think that's a big part of why I keep going, is because I know that they're watching. Not just them, but other people, whoever is watching, and to show them you just keep pushing through. So, yeah, it is. I'm very proud. He's in Blackfoot. He's considered an elder, even though he's younger than me, right? And I think I talked about that before when we were in training in Ottawa. But so it's very special. I have a lot of humility. A lot of my elders are younger than me. A lot of them are older. A lot of them are gone. And we have that very interesting dynamic to our culture that way. Yeah.
I do want to jump ship again to, as such an accomplished woman, and an Indigenous woman, no less, how does it feel to challenge the patriarchy so fiercely?
Well, good question. You know, this is something I thought about this year. I was raised by boss women. You know, I was raised around women who were true matriarchs, who didn't take crap from anyone, who made it happen if they barely had anything. You know, I always use that phrase, made stew out of nothing, right? Pulled it together, made miracles happen. That's who I came from. I also was fortunate to grow up and be molded by really incredible women around me who, you know, Blackfoot women are very special. All of our Indigenous women are very special. We all have to fight against these odds. We were natural matriarchal societies. We cannot do any of our ceremonies without the woman. And the woman is considered a very important part of our universe. So the sun, the moon in Blackfoot is called our grandmother. So I don't know why my Blackfoot is stunted when I'm like on the spot. Kukumakisam Kipitaki. So our grandmother, she's the moon, and the sun is Napinatusi. So kind of male trait. So they're balanced. You can't have one without the other. And we believe that in a Blackfoot worldview. So I think I was always kind of given that landscape environment to, it was okay. But it was definitely because I had strong women around me to show me. But then I also had really strong men around me. And they made us tough. They made us, they challenged us. I think about one of my good friends, Tayage Alfred, Dr. Gerald Alfred, and his teachings on nationhood, Indigenous nationhood. And I came into his teachings around 2006, maybe 5, 4, something like that, and teaching about warriorhood. And these guys were like direct, action people. They were in Caledonia, they were, in Oka. So they were the real McCoys, right? And the one thing they taught us about decolonizing was no fear. You throw that fear out the window. We don't have a privilege to be fearful. And so I did. you know? And it's just been that way ever since somebody gave me permission. I think about my fellow councilman, Fabian North Pagan, when I was in council. He's this feisty little Blackfoot man. And him too, just no fear, right? And so when you see it, it becomes tangible. You almost get that permission. You don't need permission, but it doesn't hurt to see it, right? To see somebody integral, standing up for what they believe in, it kind of guiding you, mentoring you to be brave, right? We're warrior people, all of us, so we're survivors. It's in our blood. So challenging the patriarchy is decolonization completely. So
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. So much to learn still. It's always nice having that, that reminder that there's still so much knowledge.
Oh yeah.
And so this is one of those wonderful.
Oh.
So I would love to know what some of your major milestones have been, in advocacy, and, you've spoken about having the council.
Yeah, I mean, that to me is one of the hardest, was being in leadership for my community. The most, I miss it. I won't lie. I will not run again. I think there's a lot of people out there who can do good work. I know where I need to be right now. But to me, I loved it. I loved the problem solving. I loved the complexity, the challenges, giving integrity to good governance. I was around a lot of leaders my whole life, a lot of politics. And good governance, due diligence, those were things I heard all over. Transparency, accountability, right? And to be put in that position where you're expected to do those things, that it's not about you, right? You have to throw your individuality out the door, and you have to be there as a group of people. And no, we weren't always the most popular, because we didn't give even our relatives, cut corners for them and give them whatever. We had to make decisions for everybody. And that was tough, because people did not like that, who wanted certain things. And that's government. In every level of government, it's like that. So that was definitely to be voted in by your community, to receive those votes. Every one of those votes, I'm honored that those people believed in me. And if I was to go back and do it again, which I won't, but if I was to go back, I would do a few things different for sure. I was young, I was in a different state, but I did my best. Some other highlights, I think, are definitely, the ability to help in education. I loved teaching in the university. I was at Banff School of Management for 15 years as a guest faculty, connecting with North American leaders. That was quite amazing, to have a tiny little spot on the radar. Now I work in federal advocacy. I'm a registered federal lobbyist for Canada, and I work with the Canadian Counseling Psychotherapy Association, and a part of my role is to challenge MPs to overturn legislation, shift policy. So, that's not too bad too, So one of the things I remember is bringing one of the first mandatory Indigenous education requirement courses to the nursing degree at U of L. I thought that was pretty cool back in 2007. So way back, right? So, there's been a few things. I've been the first Indigenous member on the Parkland Institute for U of A. I've been the first Indigenous member for IPAC, which is the Institution of Public Administration Canada for the Calgary region. So there's been a few firsts, and I'm pretty proud of those. I hope that I met expectations. Probably didn't, but it's okay because I'm not the end all be all. Just breaking down some doors. And, when you're in those first positions, I just look at it like that. I'm just knocking some doors down for the next to come in. That's all. I don't put all that pressure on myself.
Well, you sure have knocked down quite a few of the. I am wondering if you have any advice for those in the community, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, like if you have any advice in how they can have better mental hygiene practices.
Yes, when we look at mental health from an Indigenous perspective, we look at it holistically. So mind, body, spirit, to sum it up very simply. Our bodies, I always talk to my clients about, watching your body language. So when your bodies change, you get a racing heart rate, you get the nervous, twitching, you get the sweat, you get whatever. Your body's telling you it's triggered, right? It's in a what we call a trauma response. So we pay attention to that. That if we watch that language, that body language, it's a signifier. It's like a flag to us to say, hey, alert, alert, something's wrong. One of the ways that we can tell our brain, the control center, everything's okay if it's not a real threat, of course. If it is a real threat, then run, fight, do whatever you gotta do. But if it's not a real threat, which it's usually not, it's usually in our mind, we use, breathing and what we call big belly breaths, breathe into the belly, slow exhale. We did those. And it tells the brain it's calm. So, it's really all about balancing your nervous system. People, when they're in a fight, flight, or freeze context, they don't make the best decisions. So really working on being quiet, active listeners, not jumping into action when you're in those state of kind of trauma responses, fight, flight, or freeze modes, not doing things and having actions or behaviors based out of those decisions, to let yourself regulate and then, move into some of those decisions. So I think mind, body, spirit, we are all spirits in a physical body. The spirit, at least from our belief system, continues, and we as a physical body do not. So our spiritual care is really important, and how you do that is up to you, right? But, some people go out to the water, go to the mountains, put tobacco down, pray, however it is you want to do that. Take care of your spirit and, our mind. We always need to be learning, right? Learning's an important part of being a human being. So learning is lifelong. We're never at a place where we stop learning, or else our brain, our minds, gets limited, and we can turn into bitter beings and whatever, egotistical maniacs. So things like that. So always challenging yourself. I always, tell my clients, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Don't get complacent. Push yourself out of your comfort zones. Try new things. Make sure that you're getting that fresh air, that sunlight, that sleep. Those are all really essential hygiene practices for mental health. Because again, this modern context of being in a classroom for 8 hours a day, sitting in an office for 8 hours a day, we're not supposed to do that as human beings, right? So I'm all for working from home. I'm all for the 4-day work week. I'm all for shifting the reality and letting our human beings be human, because this capitalistic society way of doing things, it's not humane. So we need to shift that paradigm. We need to practice that self-well-being so we can make really informed decisions, and not decisions from kind of a unbalanced perspective.
Thank you for that. And my last question for you is, moving forward, what do you hope to accomplish next within the community?
Want to conquer the world. I don't even think about that. I really don't. I kind of let things fall in my lap. I'm from Piikani, so it's really windy back home. So I have a saying, I'm just going to let the wind blow me where it will, right? I don't really, I can't put myself in those positions to anticipate anything because, I've learned that planning often will backfire. I do want to do my PhD. I do want to do that for myself. That's definitely in the future. And I do want to go outside of the province for that. I want to have a little bit of an adventure. I want to give myself a diverse view. I was born in the States in Washington, so by accident. It's a long story. So I kind of want to go back to the States, maybe to do that education, or in BC. So I still have those kind of goals for myself, but in terms of my work, I am not, yes, I would love to see our overturn the policy I'm working for on the federal campaign. It's about increasing access to Indigenous people under the NAHB programming, our benefits program. But, I want to see my kids healthy. I want to see health indicators move in a good way. I want to open doors where I can make connectivity between people. Just do the same thing I've always been doing. I don't have too much that I want to do other than just try to be healthy and happy and get out on my kayak this summer.
Absolutely. So in terms of truth and reconciliation, for Alberta and then as Canada as a whole, where do you believe we are in those aspects?
I think in sections of the province, there's really good things happening. And I think it's unique and it's private. It's not, at a provincial level of government. It's more the private sectors that are taking more onus and, maturity with taking on the validity and respect of truth and reconciliation. Nationally, it's a tough call. I'm quite the optimist. I think that the work around climate and environment is very pro-Indigenous, and I see that as reconciliation. I'm grateful for the federal protections that are being, put in place to protect the environment and to kind of diversify energy sectors. I think that it's kind of like a tango or was salsa. I don't know what they call it. You go back, you go forward, you go back. It's going, and this undrip or can drip, whatever they're calling it, I think is another step toward trying to reconcile our rights that are protected in under the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. So it's a very legal jurisdictional battle, and people have to learn about it because they only see what the media puts out there, which is not, again, Indigenous led. It's led from a settler perspective. It's not representing our communities. It's not ever shone light or integrity on the realities of our communities as a whole. I don't have a lot of trust in those outlets. That's why I say create the space, let people come in and tell their stories, because we just don't have the privileges to write in the newspapers and whatnot. So, I think reconciliation has got a long way to go, but of doing this work and being on this earth for more than 4 decades, I've definitely seen changes that I wish my parents, my mom, my grandparents were around to see, to benefit from. I think we're working toward keeping people safer, giving us as Indigenous people basic human rights, basic respect, basic dignity in our own lands. So I do see a change. I do see growth. Of course, it's not enough. We still have Places like Manitoba, who have 95% of their kids in care are Indigenous. Alberta, 70% of the kids in care are Indigenous. So we're still seeing those indicators of systemic racism, of our Indigenous people being profiled, targeted, overrepresented in the justice system, women and children still going missing and being murdered and not having charges of their predators put in place. So we've still got a long way to go in those real realities at the grassroots level, but it takes time. It takes time for these things to trickle down, right? But again, reconciliation is proximal. Connect with whose backyard you're in, and connect with those people, to those Indigenous folks, those First Nations around, for example, the city, and learn from each other and build those relationships.
Thank you so much. Well, on behalf of Local Lives, I'd like to say thank you so much for all your knowledge and your storytelling and all the work you do.
Thank you. Thank you.